Boy, are you in for a Halloween treat tonight. This episode features about 2 hours of scary forest and wilderness stories you've never heard before, featuring skinwalkers in Montana, a tree that eats people in Nigeria, and of course, a New Zealand monster that's hunting people as we speak. These stories make up episodes 61 and 62 of Alone in the Woods, my podcast about scary outdoor encounters. You should definitely follow Alone in the Woods on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and leave us a rating or review, so we can reach and terrify new fans. A quick note, Alone in the Woods in particular is now narrated by my professionally trained AI clone, which most folks can't tell the difference. But no worries. The stories you're used to hearing on YouTube, unexplained encounters and tales from the break room, will continue to be all human. Unless I get jumped by goblins and my wife and kids need to subsist on Hamburger Helper in my absence. And if that happens, I hope you'd understand. Happy Halloween, everyone. Make it a good and safe one. If you've ever found yourself wandering too far from safety in the dead of night, you know the unsettling feeling of being watched, like something is lurking just out of sight, waiting for you to make the wrong move. Welcome back to Alone in the Woods. I'm Darkness Prevails. Before we dive in, I'm excited to announce that my new book, Appalachian Folklore Unveiled, is now available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's packed with the rich, eerie history and legends of the Appalachian region. And if you're craving even more mysterious tales, check out Phantom Phenomena, also available on both platforms. Today's stories will have you questioning every sound you hear in the dark. From encounters with shadowy figures to strange, unexplainable events, we'll explore the eerie and the unknown. If you've had your own terrifying outdoor experience, I'd love to hear it. Submit your story at eeriecast.com/outdoor, and it might just be featured on the show. Now, throw a log on the fire, because the night is still young. My dog saw it too. From Anonymous Nelson. Hey, I'm not going to give a ton of the tiny details to save time, but this is my story. I've grown up all over America. My family has moved a ton, but this story happened in Kentucky. I'm not sure if this falls under paranormal or not, because I don't really understand what happened. My immediate family is big. There are 10 of us. This means that we need a big house, otherwise we all get cramped and all that. Since we've moved around a lot, we've lived in over 15 houses in my lifetime. When we moved to Kentucky, we needed a larger house because my parents had just had kid number 8. We house hunted for a long time, but we eventually settled on a really cool one on some land. There was about 4 acres of land and a pretty large log cabin. It had 3 stories, base floor, basement, and upstairs, and it was really old. My family's rooms were upstairs, and mine was on the middle floor, right beside the kitchen. Some nights, my dad would come home really late, past 11. He worked about an hour away from our house, because we lived a good deal away from anything. We were in the woods a bit. This meant that throughout the day, my siblings and I would run the forest. We would climb trees, play in the creeks, and we would make up stories about the land. I would tell them to my sisters and scare them. That's just what you do as a 14-year-old boy. You scare your siblings. I remember the night it happened. Both of my parents and my older siblings were gone. I was the oldest at home. I was 14, and I was babysitting 4 of the kids. The house was big, and they were upstairs somewhere playing with Legos. I was in the kitchen doing homework. It was around 9:30 at night in mid-fall, so it was really dark, and since we were in the woods, there wasn't any light pollution. It gets dark out there. I was minding my own business, working on a paper. My dog, Bear, was at my feet under the table. He's a Great Pyrenees. They're bred to kill coyotes and protect livestock, so I'm not really scared of anything when he's around. He's the most loyal dog, and not much really upsets him. He never barks at things. Well, he didn't bark at things often until that night. We had a back patio that connected to our hallway. It was kind of our back door. It led outside to our garden and chickens and rabbits. The patio was made of old wood, and it creaked when you walked across it, so I would always know if someone was coming in through that door. I was sitting at the table when I heard the back doorknob jiggle. It was loose and half broken, so if someone opened the door, it would wobble in place. It needed to be fixed, but I'm so happy it was broken. Otherwise, I might not have heard it trying to come in. Immediately, Bear started growling. I was confused because I hadn't heard anyone on the creaky old patio. The night went quiet. I held my breath so I could hear better. I'm not a big kid, and I definitely wasn't then. But I kind of knew how to fight. My friends were scared to wrestle me because I usually won. I probably should have been terrified, but I had Bear, and I was slightly cocky. As I held my breath, I heard the doorknob jiggle again. I had that cold feeling when something feels wrong. I'm not sure if I could call it the hairs stand up thing, because it wasn't really that. It was more of a something feels off feeling. Bear growled so low. I had not heard him growl that deep before, so I knew something was wrong. I stood up from the table and walked to my bedroom slowly, so I wouldn't startle Bear any more than he already was. I also didn't want to alarm the kids upstairs playing. My siblings are easily spooked. I grabbed the wooden bat that was in there and started walking to the back door. I have no clue what I thought I was going to do, but probably something to the effect of opening the door, asking the burglar what he was doing, and then me and my dog would beat him up. However, when I got to the back door, it was quiet again. I was about to go back to my school when the doorknob rattled, like someone had put their hand on the other side. I gripped that doorknob, twisted it, and jerked the door wide open as hard as I could, brandishing the wooden bat and standing next to my dog. There was nothing there. I know what you listeners are thinking. Probably the wind. And that's what I said too. I told Bear to go lay down, and I walked back to the kitchen to do my school. It was quiet for the next 15 minutes. I was on edge, though. I wanted my parents and older siblings home. Bear kept on quietly growling, though. That's when I thought I heard the creaky floorboards of the patio. I wasn't going to check, though. Nothing had been there before, so why would something be there now? Bear, however, wanted to go check. He jumped up barking and snarling and ran to the back door. I yelled at him to stop because he was freaking me out, but he kept going. I got up and dragged him back to the kitchen. I didn't want to be alone anymore. I was honestly freaked out. That's when he went silent. He cocked his head like he was listening, and I could still hear my siblings playing with Legos upstairs. I was happy they weren't coming and asking what was wrong. I didn't want to scare them, especially since my parents were gone. You know the feeling you get when your heart is pounding so loud you can kind of hear it in your ears? That's what I was feeling. I was standing completely still and just waiting to hear something else. That's when I heard a stick break. Yes, I was in the kitchen, indoors, but I heard it. It sounded like a branch cracking. Keep in mind, this house was in the woods a bit, so there were tons of places it could have come from, but it sounded like it was coming from outside another door in the kitchen. That door leads to a really tall balcony. It overlooks 2 of our fields, and you can see our 2 sheds from up there. In the dark, you can't see much, but we have a single light on the large blue shed, and the light shines through the trees. It dimly lights the area around it, but of course that doesn't count for much unless you're right over by the shed. Anyway, I hear the stick or branch break. At this point, I'm kind of fed up with this thing. It's kind of like, okay, can this just be over? Or at least let me see whatever is going on? I'm weirded out, tired, and I'm kind of angry. I knew my assignment was going to be late because I couldn't do a single ounce of work because whatever this thing was, or whoever it was, kept on scaring my dog and me. So I stomped to the kitchen door and flung it open. I stepped outside onto the balcony and scanned the dark tree line. My dog came out with me and kept quiet. That's when I noticed something wrong by the shed. I looked, and you could make out the figure of a person standing by the shed. The thing is, the shed was on an incline, so to get to the other side of it was nearly impossible. I stared at the figure, trying to determine if it was my eyes playing tricks on me or not. But then Bear saw it too. He went absolutely bonkers. I've never heard him so alarmed. I kept on looking at the figure and noticed how tall it was. It measured about to the roof of the shed, which was probably 7 or 8 feet tall. I'm guesstimating, though. Being a dumb 14-year-old kid, I yelled over the barking, "Hey, who are you? Can I help you?" And the figure just stood there. It looked like it shifted its weight. I kept on wishing it would step into the light of the shed so I could see it better. But of course, if I was a burglar, I wouldn't want to be caught in the light either. I got no answer back, so I just kept on staring. I thought maybe I was yelling at a stump or something. But no, it moved. It slinked behind the shed, across the nearly 90-degree incline, and to the light. I watched as it seemed to avoid the light, and turned to look at me. I couldn't see any eyes or any real features, just a large shadow. Then, just like it was a part of the woods, it disappeared into the shadows. Bear stopped barking and laid down, facing the direction of where the figure had been. I tried to get him inside, but he wouldn't leave the balcony. I made sure the gate to the stairs was locked and went back inside. I was beyond confused. It hadn't been 15 seconds since I had heard it on the porch, yet there it was down by the shed, which was maybe a 10-minute walk, maybe a 3-minute run. Also, it was really, really steep, so taking it at a fast pace would have probably led to an accident. None of it made sense. I tried to think maybe it was just my imagination. There wasn't anyone out there, right? Well, I always tell my friends that if you see and hear something, it's your mind playing tricks. But if your dog sees it too, run. I usually say that as a joke, but in this sense, it was true. When my dad got home around 11 that night, I told him what was wrong. He went and checked out the shed with a flashlight, but he said he never saw anything. He did tell me, though, that the back porch door had been unlocked the whole time. I didn't like that. Maybe it was just a random dude in the woods, probably a bad person trying to rob us. But I didn't like how tall it had been, or how fast it had moved, and I didn't like that it knew which door was unlocked. Call me crazy, but I don't think it was a person. I try to chalk it up to hysteria, but hey, my dog saw it too. I couldn't see it. From Godfist 1. Before I begin, let me preface this with a little backstory. This took place in the spring of 2019. At the time, I was quite the insomniac, and often when I couldn't sleep, I would grab my camera and go to the woods, looking for nighttime animal life to photograph. My favorite spot was a mountain in Holyoke, Massachusetts. There were also the remnants of an old amusement park ski lodge I would explore up there. Also, I recently obtained my license to carry and purchased my very first handgun. It was a little Smith & Wesson 380, and to be honest, it probably wouldn't have done much good against a bear or other large predator, but it made me feel safe. So on this particular night, it was probably around 1 or 2 in the morning. I had been taking photos of frogs, toads, millipedes, and basically any nightlife I could find. It was a beautiful night, and I was enjoying myself quite thoroughly. Typically, no one was up there at that time of night, so I was alone. I had played on the ground to take another photo of a millipede when I heard something. In front of me was a large rock face and some vegetation, but the vegetation was still thin as it was early spring. I heard something coming down the side of the rock face and into the foliage. Whatever this was, it was big. The footsteps were very heavy. I could almost feel the vibration in the ground underneath me. As this thing got closer, I jumped to my feet, unholstered my sidearm, and pointed it in the direction of the noise. The footsteps stopped about 10 to 15 feet in front of me, but I couldn't see it. As I said earlier, the foliage was still thin, and where it stopped, I should have seen something, but there was nothing. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I called out, "Is anyone there?" My answer came in the form of 3 low, rumbling, guttural grunts. At this moment, my firearm felt very small, and I knew by the sound of this thing coming down the rock face, my gun would do very little to protect me now. I slowly began to back away, gun still pointed in the direction of this thing. I backed up around 200 feet before turning and making the quarter-mile walk back to my car. The whole time, I kept my weapon unholstered, ready in case this thing came after me. But it never did. I got to my car and sped home, thankful that I was unharmed. The next day, I started looking up animal vocalizations for predators we had in our area. Nothing matched, not bear, cougar, or wolves, nothing. I started replaying the events in my head, focusing on the footsteps. Deer? No, deer are very light on their feet. Cougar? No, cougars are very quiet. I would never have even heard it if one was stalking me. Maybe a bear then? But again, I couldn't see it, and I should have been able to. It is by far one of the most frightening things I've ever experienced. I've had other experiences there, wood knocking and so on, but that's a story for another time. In the end, it's a mystery to me. I still go hiking all the time, still at night on occasion, but I carry a much bigger handgun now, and I never hike without it. Be careful out there, folks. You never know what's in the woods, and never go unarmed. Something was in the lake. From Mr. Blippity Blup. This story happened when I was 7, when me, my dad, and one of his friends went camping together at a lake in Arkansas. It started out normal enough. We found a remote area on the edge of the lake and put up our tents, started a fire, etc. However, later that night, we heard these deep, bellowing calls coming from the lake. We decided upon the explanation that it was just some kind of bird or something, so we went to sleep. The next morning, it was cool, and a light fog blanketed the lake. Seeing the nice fishing weather, me, my dad, and his friend went fishing on the lake. It went pretty well. My dad's friend caught a nice trout, and my dad and I managed to get a few fish too. By then, we had been fishing for a few hours, and were having a good time when we saw something out in the lake. It was a deer swimming across the lake about 15 yards away, and at first, we didn't pay it any mind until we noticed something swimming behind it. A large shape just beneath the water's surface was trailing the deer, and the shape was big, maybe 3 times as long as our boat. The boat was 10 feet long. We watched intently as the shape gained on the deer and eventually pulled it under with a large splash similar to that of a bass taking a lure. After this encounter, we decided to head back to shore and get ready for bed. We eventually went to sleep. We awoke to the sound of something pulling itself across the gravel beach. My dad poked his head out of the tent and concentrated his flashlight straight ahead of him and saw it. A massive creature the size of a truck staring back at him with black, beady eyes, saliva running down the 2 tusks protruding out of its mouth. The best way I can describe it is a mix between a walrus, whale, and a dinosaur. After my dad stared this thing down for about 5 minutes, it crashed back into the water and swam back into the depths of the lake. Let's just say that we went home early. To this day, we have no idea what that thing was or where it came from. The Watcher in the Woods, from Hambalpal. One summer night, I found myself alone in a secluded cabin deep in the woods. It was meant to be a peaceful retreat, a place to disconnect from the digital world and immerse myself in nature. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, craving the solitude and the quiet that the city could never offer. The first couple of days were blissful. I spent my time hiking, reading, and sitting by the lake, listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. The cabin was small but cozy, with a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room that boasted a large stone fireplace. It was the perfect escape. One evening, as the sun began to set and the forest grew dim, I decided to take a walk. The air was cool, and the sounds of the forest at dusk were both calming and eerie. I wandered down a narrow path I hadn't explored before, enjoying the twilight. After about half an hour, I noticed the light fading faster than I had anticipated. Not wanting to get lost, I turned back towards the cabin. As I retraced my steps, I heard a faint rustling in the underbrush. I stopped, straining to hear. The forest was usually alive with nocturnal sounds, but this was different. It was deliberate, like someone or something was following me. I quickened my pace, the uneasy feeling growing stronger with every step. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had disappeared completely, and darkness had settled over the woods. I bolted the door behind me and laughed at my paranoia. It was just the forest, I told myself. There's nothing out there. I lit a fire in the fireplace and settled into an armchair with a book, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Hours passed, and I began to doze off when a loud bang jolted me awake. The noise had come from outside, near the back of the cabin. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the rear window. Shining the beam outside, I saw nothing but the dense trees and undergrowth. I told myself it was probably a falling branch or a raccoon scavenging for food. I was about to turn away when I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes reflecting the light from my flashlight. They were low to the ground, watching me from the edge of the forest. I froze, unable to move, my breath caught in my throat. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just stared back at me with an unsettling intensity. After what felt like an eternity, the eyes disappeared. I stood there for several minutes, waiting to see if they would return, but the forest remained silent. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one, and finally returned to the armchair, though sleep was now out of the question. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I packed up my things and left the cabin earlier than planned. As I drove away, I glanced back at the forest and saw those eyes again, watching me from the shadows. Shaken, but determined to understand what I had seen, I did some research on the area when I returned home. I discovered local legends about a creature known as the Watcher, said to inhabit those very woods. Stories of glowing eyes following unsuspecting travelers were common, though sightings were rare. The legend varied. Some described the Watcher as a guardian of the forest, while others as a malevolent spirit. I reached out to a few locals, hoping to learn more. Most were dismissive, chalking it up to folklore. but one old man took my inquiry seriously. He told me his own story of encountering the Watcher as a young man. His description matched mine: glowing eyes, silent observation, and a profound sense of being watched. He warned me never to return, suggesting that those who ignored the warning often disappeared without a trace. Years have passed since that night, yet the memory remains vivid. I still find myself drawn to the forest, wondering about the Watcher and the truth behind the legend. Despite the lingering curiosity, I have heeded the old man's warning and stayed away. The forest, with its secrets and its eyes, remains a place I admire from afar, content to let its mysteries remain unsolved. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe it was something else entirely. But I haven't been back to that cabin since, and I don't think I ever will. Carnivorous Trees and Portals in Trees, from Gojo's Six Eyes. I shared a story on here about a childhood experience of a tree with moving red eyes. Well, I got around to asking my aunt to confirm that I wasn't somehow hallucinating, and she did confirm what we saw. She expressed shock that I even recalled the event. It felt good to get that confirmation from her. But the stories I'm about to share in this post were experienced by my grandmother and mother on separate occasions, decades apart. For a bit of backstory, in my culture, it is believed that trees were simply portals and hosts to supernatural beings and phenomena. And as I grew older, I've heard stories about travelers who knew the signs to look for when searching for trees that have given up their will or succumbed to an entity. Depending on these signs, they either avoided the tree or sat resting on the trunk in hopes that the entity in the tree would allow them to seek cover before they continued their travels. So, because of this, people were warned never to make promises, curses, or statements anywhere near trees, because it is believed that the tree serves as a witness to your declarations and contains the energy to manifest anything said within its vicinity. My grandmother shared a personal experience with me years ago that I only recalled hours ago when I had to step out of the way for a bike to pass, which led to me standing with my back very close to a tree. I got instant goosebumps recalling that memory while being in such close proximity to a tree. This story unfolded when my grandmother was still in secondary school, in an all-girls boarding school. And for the sake of distinguishing between my grandmother's and mother's stories, I shall give them subtitles relating to the incident, starting with my grandmother's experience. Entities walking out of a tree holding lanterns. This event took place within the premises of my grandmother's boarding school. It was during exam week, and every room was lit with lanterns as students got their late-night reading on in preparation for the exams the next day. My grandmother was on the balcony of the third floor of the hostel when the cluster of banana trees in front of the hostel compound seemed to smoke from the top of the branches. At first, it seemed as if the smoke was probably coming from outside the fence of the hostel, because there was a garbage pit where the school burned garbage in front of the hostel. But there was no sign of the orange glow of fire, and the smoke definitely looked to be coming from inside the banana trees, which was odd because there were no fire embers within the trees whatsoever. So that was quite unsettling, and as she began to contemplate notifying the hall officer about a possible fire outbreak, she saw figures in a straight line walk out of the trees, each holding a lit lantern very much like the ones students use for late-night readings. The figures were very dark in color, but had stark white polka dot spots all over their bodies. They just kept filing out while making absolutely no sound walking across the compound, seemingly unseen by the students on the ground floor who had their lanterns on and faces buried in their books. My grandmother was absolutely terrified that no one seemed to notice this long file of beings walking across the compound. It was simply impossible that no one budged or acknowledged their presence. So she immediately blew her lantern out and quietly, without turning her back, walked backwards into her room. Her roommate looked at her strangely and asked why she was walking into the room backwards and what happened to her lantern. But she simply placed her lantern on her table and crawled into bed. She stayed awake, wondering why she seemed to be the only one to see those things. She never told anyone anything until the moment she told me, with a very serious warning to avoid banana trees at all costs. My mother's story, Carnivorous Tree. This second story belongs to my mother, coincidentally while she was also in boarding school. A couple of years before my mother even enrolled in that particular secondary school, multiple people had gone missing, but no one could have possibly ever connected it to the seemingly regular huge tree planted on school grounds for cool shade from the scorching sun. Usually, all searches for the missing persons, students, staff, non-staff alike, turned up empty with no trace or explanations until my mother witnessed something truly horrifying from the balcony of a friend's house located exactly opposite the school. Her friend was a day student for obvious reasons, and my mother was hanging out at her place before she had to go back to her hostel when she saw it happen. She was on the balcony of her friend's house, having a nice lunch. She was alone on the balcony at that time, and she could very clearly see into the school compound, watching students play around or just sitting around. She said she had a couple of loud conversations from her friend's balcony with students who were still in the school compound because it was a Friday, and so students were allowed to be extra rowdy. Now, the day being Friday is actually very significant because it was Jimo, which meant that the mosques would be filled with Muslims. Every Friday, mosques are filled with Muslims in their finest wares to offer prayers, and students were let out of school early so the Muslim students could go home and prepare for Jimo. Eventually, the school grounds got empty real fast as everyone rushed home or to the mosque, and only very few people were left loitering the grounds when she saw it. A student sitting under the huge tree, where people typically sat during break period, with his back resting on the tree with a book in hand. But that wasn't the mind-numbing thing about that image. The horrifying thing was that the tree the student had his back to opened up like a gaping dark hole slightly above the student's head, and she swore it looked like a mouth opening up. She screamed so loudly that the student turned his head towards the building she was at, along with some people still on school grounds. The turning of the student made his body slightly distant from the tree, and a very loud snap was heard from the tree, making the boy and everyone jump and look at the tree, barely catching the image of a tree literally snapping a gaping hole in its trunk shut. There was a moment of absolute silence before chaos ensued, and the student leapt far away from the tree, with the staff and students alike backing far from it. My mother watched as some people ran from the school compound towards the mosque and came back with some Islamic clerics towards the tree. She proceeded to describe hours of bone-chilling events. First, the clerics asked for the tree to be chopped, which no one wanted to do. So they began to recite Quranic verses, which gave a few men courage to hack away at the tree. Everyone watched in morbid fascination as thick, red, sap-like substance seeped out of the tree. And the more they hacked away, the more the red-like substance seeped out. It took hours to hack this tree in half, and that's when they started to see clothing items, school uniforms, belts, shoes, pieces of paper, etc. It was absolutely unbelievable what they were witnessing, and people started to murmur about the missing persons whose trace could never be found. The clerics never broke their recitations the entire time, as the tree was hacked till its roots, and items were pulled out covered in red substance. My mother and her friend, who eventually joined her at the balcony, watched as the clerics spent hours long into the evening cleansing the spot where the tree once stood, and people tried to recover the items found in hopes to identify who they belonged to, while the student who was sitting under the tree earlier was engulfed by even more clerics reciting Quranic verses to rid him of any negative energy. It was later said that a goblin known as Abora lived in that tree and consumed unsuspecting people. The spot where the tree once stood was covered in cement and became flat ground, but everyone avoided getting near it regardless. To this day, I have a deep fear of trees, and something about them always seems terrifying. I make a conscious effort to never get too close to one. I thought New Zealand was a safe place to go camping. From Itchy Wool Pants. New Zealand is an incredibly beautiful place, especially if you're interested in outdoor activities such as camping and hiking, and while I don't enjoy living here, I love the scenery and natural beauty of these islands. You see, I'm Australian, but I've spent most of my life in New Zealand. The wildlife is incredibly tame compared to Australia. There's nothing here at all that's really dangerous. Brief history. Prior to the arrival of the Maori some 600-800 years ago, the islands were dominated by birds, plants, and insects, with the only mammals being 2 species of bat. The ghosts of Gondwana, as they say, are due to millions of years of isolation. The Maori brought pigs, rats, and dogs. The Europeans brought the rest of the mammals found here, and a heck of a lot of introduced plants and birds, too. So overall, the risk of attacks by any type of animal while camping is essentially 0. The largest mammalian predators are dogs, cats, weasels, and stoats, and in the 34 years I've lived here, I've never seen a weasel nor a stoat in the wild, let alone a feral dog. Cats? Sure, sometimes, but not often. Now, even though I really don't like living here, I do often recommend that people I know who've never been here come to visit at least once, solely for the immense natural beauty. One person who took me up on this offer was a cousin of mine from Australia. We'd only met when we were babies and toddlers, and I have a vague memory of meeting her when I lived in Sydney, probably age 3. She's a year younger than me, so she doesn't remember it. We connected on social media a long time ago, and we hit it off. She's cool, so when she told me she wanted to come and visit me here in New Zealand, I was excited. I planned a road trip around the South Island, which is where I live. Christchurch, to be specific. To me, the South Island is the best island in this archipelago. We were going to have an amazing time, I thought. After her arrival, we spent a night at my house, then set off south, with the first stop being scheduled to be Mount Cook, or Aoraki in the Ngāi Tahu dialect of Māori. However, upon arrival, we found it raining, and I wasn't in the mood to set up 2 tents for us to sleep in the rain. We decided to go further south, and luckily we found a place that we could set our tents up for free, and it wasn't raining. By the time we found this place, it was getting dark. It was by a river and was heavily forested. But, being New Zealand, the land of no dangerous wildlife, this didn't bother me in the slightest. During the process of setting up the tents, I found that the one I brought for me to use was missing parts essential for it to be set up at all. This meant I'd have to share with my cousin. No big deal. We're family, even if it was initially awkward, because I'm a man and she's a woman. We got a fire going, cooked and ate, spent some amazing time under the clear skies talking about pretty much everything we could think of. Finally, we were tired enough to sleep, so we got into the tent and talked a bit before we drifted off. At some stage during the night, I woke up to a horrible sound, like gurgling and sputtering. I sat up and looked at my cousin. The darkness of the night made everything seem black and white, and I saw this black liquid bubbling out of her throat as she gagged and gurgled, moving her head slowly side to side. Blood was everywhere, pumping out of a massive gash in her throat, and she was simultaneously choking to death and bleeding to death. I didn't know what was going on, but I started to panic. I was in shock that something or someone had torn her throat open. Next thing I remember is waking up, for real this time, and realizing it was just a dream. It felt so real, it was so vivid. I was incredibly perturbed by this, but eventually, I did manage to sleep again. The next morning, I told her about it, and how vivid it was, how real it felt, how terrified I was that something had torn her throat open, and that she was choking and sputtering on her own blood as it pumped out of her throat and pooled around her head. We both thought that it was surreal, but a dream, nothing to worry about. When I opened the tent door and got out of the tent, I saw that right outside the tent was the carcass of a rabbit, throat torn open, but not eaten. This was definitely not there when I put the tent up, nor was it there when we went to sleep. As I have stressed, New Zealand is safe. There's nothing here to pose any danger. There's nothing that would rip the throat out of a rabbit, nor any animal or human, and not eat the carcass. And to leave it outside of the tent like that, that is just bizarre. I've never experienced anything like that, and I don't even know what it could have been. Perhaps there is something here that humans don't know about. Whatever it was enough to send chills through me that persist to this day, many years later. The Beast of Red Lake Reservation, from Drado 49. I'm a 23-year-old Chippewa Native American from the Red Lake Indian Reservation in Minnesota. My people don't usually speak of this because they believe that if you speak of it or even say its name, it will hear you, and it will only be drawn closer to you. But I'm willing to take my chances and tell you the first time I saw the Wendigo. I was about 14 years old at the time, and I was told about the story of the hunter who got lost in a terrible blizzard and was forced into cannibalism. The spirit of the Wendigo was born, looking for his next victim to possess. But I was young and dumb, so I didn't really believe it. The next day, I went out with my friends. Let's call them Ben and Kevin. We just sat outside for an hour and had nothing else to do, so we decided to go to the point where we could look for some cool-looking stones or something. Nobody ever goes swimming in this part of the lake, but that's another story for another time. Anyway, back to the story. We got ready to head out. We were going to bring our bikes, but we decided to walk. It was only a half-mile away, after all. My friends decided to bring their dog along. His name was Poppy. So as we began to walk, my friend said, "Hey, Kevin, did you bring a cigarette?" Which he did. He only had one, so we had to do 3 drags each. As we finished our cigarette, we were almost there, but I felt like we were being watched from the woods. I thought I was just paranoid or something like that. As we got there, we started skipping rocks and found a few arrowheads that were still intact. Ben and Kevin started arguing about something. I didn't really hear what they were arguing about. Probably not important. Fast forward 1 hour. It was around sunset, and we decided to head back home. So, as we got to the Y, we all heard this loud, blood-curdling scream. Let me tell you, it sounded like a man's scream mixed with the screech of an elk. As we heard it, we saw a big buck run by, followed by something. As it gets to an opening, that's when we saw it. It was about 9 feet tall and pale as it stopped to look at us. It let out the same scream, and that was our cue to get out of there. We got back to my house and told my parents about what happened. And of course, they didn't believe us. But my grandmother heard us. She called us to talk and said, "I believe you saw the beast that roams these woods, a demon that we call the Wendigo. You were lucky enough to be alive and tell the tale. And from that day, I always keep my guard up. I think that deer saved us from it. If that deer wasn't there, one of us probably wouldn't be here. Stay safe, everyone. There are things in this world that we don't understand. Thanks for letting me share my story." Wendigo in Ontario, Canada, from Shuck. Hi there, I'm Mallow, and I'm 23 years old. I used to live in Canada until my husband and I moved to Florida. Just recently, my brother told me this story. I'll be telling this from his point of view, and from how he's telling it to me. This happened a few years ago when he and his boyfriend, Theo, were 20. Me and Theo had just gotten into a big fight. We were fuming and hadn't talked to each other for a few days. Finally, my sister, Mallow, told me to reach out and ask him if he wanted to do something like camping or hiking. I knew Theo liked being outdoors and enjoyed spending time with me. "Oh, come on, Keith," Mallow urged. I agreed to talk to him and take him up to Niagara. I left the living room and headed upstairs. Once I made it into my room, I closed the door and made the phone call. It rang a few times before someone answered. "Keith?" Theo answered. "Theo, I'm sorry. I was wondering if I could try to make this better." The phone was silent for a few moments before Theo spoke again. "What were you thinking about doing?" I sighed in relief and told him about my thoughts. He agreed and said he couldn't wait. "I'll pick you up tomorrow," I said, trying to hide my excitement. "See you then," Theo replied. I hung up and started packing for the trip to Niagara the next day. After a good night's sleep, I went downstairs with my hand in my sweater pockets. I went into the kitchen and peered out the window above the sink. My sister's car was missing. I ignored this and made myself some eggs and toast. When the sizzling eggs started moving, I reached for the spatula. I placed them on my flower-decorated plate and sat down at the marble table. I ate quickly and hurried out the front door. I walked out to my red Volvo and got into the driver's seat, pushing the key into the ignition. I left the driveway and headed for Theo's place. Skipping ahead a little bit, I had just made it to Theo's house. I found him sitting on the steps leading to the front door. He was looking at his phone with his headphones on. I sat there for a few moments, waiting for Theo to look up, but he didn't. I honked the horn, a bit annoyed. His head shot up, and he looked at me, surprised. He smiled brightly and got into the front seat, throwing his bag in the back. "I missed you," he said, as I started driving. "Same here," I said, glancing at him quickly. He grabbed my hand and squeezed gently. I smiled and kept my eyes fixed to the road. It was a few hours from where Theo lived to Niagara, so on the way there, we passed the time by talking about what had happened the past few weeks. Skipping further ahead, we had just finished the hike and made it to a nice clearing in the forest. The sky was turning gray, and we heard distant thunder booming. Quickly, we found a dry spot and threw up the tent. The rain came out of nowhere, pelting down like bullets. "Hurry, Keith!" Theo cried, throwing himself into the open tent. I slipped into the tent and zipped the door shut. Theo rolled around, giggling widely. I smiled and laid down, exhausted from the long day. Theo was one of those people who believed in the supernatural, but I always had that see it to believe it frame of mind. "Can I tell you something?" I asked. Theo sat up and looked down at me. "Of course," Theo said. "That weird deer creature you mentioned when we first got together. I think I shot it the other day." The Wendigo? Theo asked. Yeah, that thing, the Wendigo. Theo stiffened and shook his head with a worried expression. Don't say its name, he warned. Why? Are you scared? Wendigo, 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 I teased. Shut up, Theo hissed. Little did I know, saying its name only made everything worse. I got into my sleeping bag and slept next to Theo. I chatted with him for a little bit before I did that, but it's not important. The next morning I woke up and shivered. A cold morning dew covered the tent. I went outside to relieve myself. I walked a little ways from the tent and walked through a fog which seemed to come out of nowhere. After I was done doing my business, I zipped up my pants and walked back towards the tent, or at least in the direction I thought the tent was. I stumbled around in the fog for what seemed like hours. Keith, Theo called. I'm over here, I called back. Keith. I paused for a moment, thinking about what direction his voice came from. That was the weird thing, though. His voice seemed to be coming from every direction. Come on, Keith, Theo called. I stood there, looking around nervously. I didn't think this was Theo, but if it wasn't, what was imitating his voice so perfectly? A shiver ran down my spine as I remembered Theo telling me, the Wendigo can mimic voices perfectly, but if you go towards it, there's a chance you might never come back. I backed away from where I thought the voice was coming from, although I was disoriented and couldn't think straight. A shiver rushed down my spine again, but this time it was due to how I'd bumped into something hard. I froze, thinking it was probably a tree or something, but this thing was breathing on my neck. Now keep in mind, I'm 6'4", so it's not every day something breathes on me. I spun around quickly and screamed. This was a deer, but it was wrong. It was standing on its back legs and showing its sharp yellow teeth in an evil smile. It slowly started walking towards me, getting on all fours and growling. I backed away and observed its features. It had long claws that dug into the ground as it walked. It had chunks missing from its body, and it smelled like rotting flesh. I ran in the opposite direction of the creature. I felt it chasing after me as I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran. Ahead of me, the fog ended. This was unusual, but I was thankful because I could make out the tent's outline. I burst out of the fog and fell to the ground, breathing deeply. Theo unzipped the tent and glanced at me with a worried look. Are you okay? He asked. We need to leave, I demanded, getting to my feet and grabbing everything outside the tent. Theo did not question me. He packed everything up and threw it into his bag. Now it was time to hike back. Theo stood by my side as we made our way back to the car. I glanced around, looking for anything out of the ordinary. My eyes skimmed past a few trees. That's when I caught a glimpse of it. But when I looked back to where it was gone. Did you see it? Theo asked. I nodded, still looking at the trees. He grabbed my hand and pecked my cheek. I looked at him, smoldering a little bit. I looked back into the forest. Hey, Keith, Theo said. Yeah? I asked, looking back at him. His face went pale, and sweat dripped down his forehead. That wasn't me, he said, sending a chill through me. My heart started to race. We gotta ditch the bags, I said, stopping and dropping my backpack. Theo did the same and started walking faster. We took turns glancing into the forest and looking ahead. I stepped over a few tree roots and sighed. We were about halfway done with the hike. Skipping ahead a little bit, me and Theo stopped to take a break. He was tired and sat down on a rock. I just noticed how quiet everything had been, and that I couldn't even hear my footsteps. Theo stood up quickly and started walking again. He turned to look back and shrieked. I also looked back and cried out too. About 10 yards behind us was the creature from before. It was walking quickly and had its tongue dragging against the ground, as if it was trying to taste us. Theo and I ran as quickly as we could. "Why did you have to say its name?" Theo yelled at me. "I didn't think it was real," I said, still sprinting. A smell hit me. It came out of nowhere and was blinding my senses. It stung my eyes and made me gag. Theo screamed as he fell to the ground. I stopped abruptly and ran back to him. I helped him up as the creature neared. We dashed, but the Wendigo caught the back of my shirt. I yelped as it threw me to the ground. It crawled on top of me and pushed down on my chest. The air inside of me was forced out as it pushed down harder. I screamed in pain as I felt my ribs break under the pressure of this horrid creature. Theo smashed a stick against the Wendigo's head. It shrieked and let go of me. It turned to Theo and hissed. I stood up and grabbed Theo's hand as we both began to sprint again. I looked back and saw that it had stopped chasing us. We burst out of the forest and fell to the ground, exhausted. Theo started laughing. "Suck it, Wendigo!" he screamed into the forest. He started laughing again. I cried out in pain as I tried to get up. "Keith, you're bleeding," Theo said, rushing to my side. "You saved me," I said, looking at him. "Well, no duh, but you're bleeding," Theo said. My eyes felt heavy suddenly. "Don't close your eyes," Theo said, his voice slurring. He was screaming at me, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. Tears ran down Theo's face as everything started going black. I awoke in a fully white room. A heart monitor beeped beside me. I was confused for a second before remembering the past events. Someone grabbed my hand, causing me to jump. "I was so worried," Theo said, tears welling up in his eyes. "I'm fine," I said, looking at the rib belt around me. "It was really bad," Theo said, gesturing to my ribs. "It hurts really bad," I said, taking short breaths. 17 broken ribs, Keith," Theo said, shaking his head. "That's the last time I saw the Wendigo. At least I hope it is. I'm 27 now, and I'm married to Theo. We still talk about the beast that caused breathing problems for me, but we never say its name, for we fear it will come back." I got out of there fast. From Fractal Wizard. A little bit of preface. I grew up in a small rural town on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia, on a property that had 156 acres of bush. My stepdad at the time carved out some trails for me and my siblings to ride our dirt bikes on when we weren't at school, etc. Any chance I got, I'd be out there and never experienced anything like this before. I was the sort of kid who got a kick out of being out there all by myself, and always felt safe and content with my own attempt at teen versus wild. To the point, I would quite regularly grab a tent and a backpack full of snacks, jump on my bike, and find a new spot to pitch up the tent, just to enjoy being away from it all. I never felt in danger of any predators, since there aren't any, unlike in other countries, and any animal that would even remotely come close to causing me harm would immediately go the other way the moment they heard my dirt bike. So being out there always felt tranquil. But this day was different. It was about 7:30 in the evening, and being the middle of summer, it was still fairly bright out on the trails, so I thought nothing of jumping on my bike and going for a ride for a few hours. Along one of my favorite trails, a tree had fallen across it, so any time I decided to ride it, when I got to that spot, I'd have to stop and pick my front wheel up and prop it on the log so I could ride over it and continue. But when I pulled up to the log, something just didn't feel right. I was immediately incredibly uneasy. It felt like someone was staring daggers through me, with 1,000 years of rage in their eyes, and it made every hair on my body stand on its end. But I looked around and saw absolutely nothing, and quickly brushed it off as just me being irrational because I had one too many energy drinks. Not to mention the nearest neighbor, or even any random person, would be walking on our property for hours just to reach this spot. But then, I heard what sounded like twigs being snapped, and walked over behind me back in among the tree line, which immediately brought my heart rate back up to 11. I scanned around again, and again saw nothing. But this time, I just felt like I was in a world of danger and had no idea why. I started sheepishly saying, "Hello? Is anyone there?" and got zero response except for the sound of twigs breaking around me. And that's when I heard it. A voice came from somewhere beside me saying, "Help me." But it sounded like two little girls saying it in unison, and it flipped me right out. I had never been more scared in my entire life. I ripped my bike over the log and rode faster than I ever have in my entire life out of there. But as I was starting to make some distance, whatever that thing was shrieked so loud, and it sounded super unnatural, almost like a person screaming at the same time as the sound a truck makes as it's screeching to a halt. I just kept going until I reached the other side of the property and pushed over a barbed wire fence, which backed onto a dirt road, and full throttled my bike back home. The only person I told about this was my little brother, and at the time he just called me a liar, and we moved on from it. It took me quite a while to build up the courage to ride those trails again, especially that one. But after that, I never experienced anything like it again. It's been 10+ years since that day, and I still have no idea what that thing was. Let's hope I never have to find out. Haunting Forest, from Echo. For a bit of context, I was an undersized teen, with short brown hair and a grunge emo style, as well as Christian parents. My parents are very religious and unsupportive of LGBT and other religions. I had just come out to them as bisexual, which they thought was satanic, and after looking through my search history and other personal things, they decided to send me to a sort of camp for troubled kids, which will remain unnamed for privacy purposes. The second I arrived at the campgrounds, I got a bad feeling about the place. The counselors looked shaken and tired, and after reading through the contract my parents signed, I was certain something was wrong. The contract stated that I was to not speak badly of the place. I would not gossip about people or events happening here, and that if I wandered off on my own, they had no responsibility for my death. I walked out of the bus and onto the grounds, approaching a counselor. "Hey, what's happening here? Like, what are we doing?" I asked, trying to stay polite. The counselor looked down with a tired yet almost guilty expression. He simply pointed at a cabin that had a sign saying orientation on it. I sighed, trudging forwards and into the building. What happened there most of the time is irrelevant, but one part had my attention. Once we'd finished with introductions, the counselor organizing the thing started explaining the rules. They were pretty basic, like no sneaking out at night and follow directions. However, a few were strange. Close your blinds at night and stay quiet, as well as the forest and river are off limits unless you're accompanied by an adult. I thought the second one was simply a rule because of the bad area or wild animals. Anyway, soon enough, we were given cabins to share with 4 other people. In my case, there were 2 boys and 3 girls, including me. One of the boys was your average high school jock. The second was your average nerd. One of the girls was shy and quiet, while the other was a pick-me. Great, Just great, I thought, taking out my headphones and putting them on, beginning to unpack my stuff with a few, "Oh, you wear so much makeup," and, "Wow, you're so pretty. I wish I was that pretty," comments from the pick-me, whose name I thought to be Jessie. I can see why she's here, I thought, finishing unpacking. My bed was near the window with a clear view of the forest, which I thought to be rather creepy. I'd seen a few things rustling around in there before, but brushed it off as other campers breaking the rules. Somewhere near noon, we were cooped up into a large cafeteria-like building and served dinner. I sat alone, watching the others socialize. I overheard a few kids nearby talking about some weird deer, or not quite human voices coming from the forest, which I once again shrugged off to just weird gossip. After noon, we had camp activities, which are pretty much irrelevant to the story. We finished sometime near the evening, and then were back in our cabins for curfew. For some reason, the counselor showed us how to lock the door and windows from the inside, and told us not to open the door or windows until morning. We agreed, pretending to care. However, sometime during the night, a knock came from the window. The jock-looking guy sat up and went to check what it was. But I stopped him, a feeling of dread filling my body. "Didn't they tell us to close the blinds and keep quiet?" I asked, earning a laugh from the pick-me girl who was also awake. "Don't listen to her, Jake. Echo's just being a coward," she laughed. I huffed in response, stepping back to allow him to open the blinds, determined to prove I wasn't scared. Jake opened the blinds, jumping back with wide eyes. "You good?" I asked, helping him up while looking out the window, only to see absolutely nothing. He simply got up and closed the blinds, turning off all the lights and making sure the door was locked before going back to bed. I shrugged it off as paranoia. Yes, I know I was rather stupid. Sometime through the night, at about 2 a.m., I heard a scratchy sort of sound, almost like a mix of all voices of my family members coming from the door. "Let me in," it said. I shuddered, taking a dagger out of my backpack, which the counselors failed to confiscate. I stayed silent. The voice came again. "Let me in," it said again, scratching on the door with what I thought was razor-sharp claws. I wondered why it wasn't breaking down. The weak wooden door. This kept happening for a few nights in a row. A few days later, however, we were woken up by a terrifying human shriek coming from a nearby cabin. Me and the nerd guy both got up, grabbing whatever weapons we could find and walking out to check it out. What we saw terrified us. Scarlet liquid littered the area around the cabin, leading into the dense forest around us. The cabin was empty, except for the counselors gathered around. Inside the cabin, it looked like a tornado came through it. Things scattered around, and even a few human parts chopped off and on random places around the cabin. Me and the nerd guy, whose name turned out to be Oscar, were horrified. We theorized as to what happened, but nothing could explain it perfectly. I told him about the voice I heard earlier during my stay. He said he'd heard a similar thing when he was taking a stroll through the forest. However, it wasn't saying anything, just letting out weird grumble-like noises. I wish I could say that was it, though. Campers kept disappearing. The pick-me, called Jessie, went out onto the beach and vanished. The shy girl disappeared into the forest one night, and the jock got himself sent to an asylum after wandering in the forest. A few people from other cabins, too. A girl named Lucy drowned. A group of 3 campers, Emily, Katie, and Josh, disappeared during a kayaking activity. The boat was found punctured and bloody near shore. Due to all these disasters, the camp was soon shut down. Me and Oscar kept in touch. His family owned a farm near the camp, and he soon vanished as well. I have no idea what happened in that camp, but I know for sure I hadn't imagined anything. Everything and everyone were real, and all the voices were real. A few years later, I read into the history of the camp. It was right near a graveyard in the forest and was built on sacred ground. The counselors also disappeared sometime in those few years. I moved out of the town and into a different county, haunted by those encounters. To this day, I am scared and confused. Supernatural Encounters in Central Montana, from MM 2007. This post entails a collection of supernatural encounters which I've heard from friends and family members over the past few months and years. All these stories will have taken place in Central Montana. For privacy, I won't disclose exact locations. The first story I'll share is from my father, which took place in March of 2022, I believe. When I was a freshman, we moved from our old ranch house to our new house. We're about 25 miles away from where my father and I both thought we saw a shapeshifter one winter morning. Since we've moved into our new house, we've had plenty of odd experiences, but this is one of the first I can recall. My father says that one night in March of my freshman year, he remembers hearing a group of people conversing and talking just down off the hill, near the creek below our house. For reference, we live about 21 miles out of town on a hill near the mountains. Our house isn't surrounded by trees, but you can see the mountain across from my house, which goes into the next county. Anyway, my father would go and check to see if there was anyone down near the creek. No one would be there, but this occurrence continued for a few months, until one day it just stopped. My father is Native American, more specifically Amskapi Pikuni, or Southern Piegan, of the Blackfeet tribe. He grew up in northern Montana, on the Blackfeet Reservation. The property we now live on used to be both Blackfeet and Crow country before the establishment of reservations. The Crow and the Blackfeet were constantly battling each other. In fact, there's still bad blood between the two tribes today. Anyway, my father believes that the voices he heard were those of crow shadows, or crow ghosts. Growing up with the stories of my dad's people and traditions, I believed every word of what he said. I, too, have had my own experiences with crow ghosts in this same county. But that's for another time. This second story is from the summer of 2023, my sophomore year, going into junior year. My middle sister and I used to go on evening walks down the dirt road every night. On this particular night, we had walked a bit farther than usual. By the time we were almost back to the gate which led to our driveway, the sun was nearly fully set. We suddenly heard what sounded like our youngest sister play screaming near the reservoir across the road from our house, just off the hill. I looked at my sister, let's call her R, and asked if she heard anything. She nodded, and I told her, "On 3, we run back to the porch." We did just that, and as soon as we made it back to our house, we asked our youngest sister, who was just watching TV on the couch, if she had yelled or screamed at all. "No, why?" she replied. R and I both just nodded and brushed her questions off. We don't really speak of that experience, but I believe that whatever my father and I saw 3 years ago followed us to our new house, or it at least lives in the general area, considering we only moved about 30 minutes away from our old house. This third story is a recollection of events which happened from June 2024 to around July-August of 2024. In June of last summer, my father began finding old arrowheads and spearheads just outside of the house, maybe 50 yards away, as well as down near the creek below the house. He believes that some of these date back to around 1,000 years ago. My father recalls that after finding these old arrowheads, he began to feel uneasy in the house. I noticed a change in the atmosphere too. During the week of June 14th, my family, mom, dad, and 2 sisters, all went on a trip to visit friends in Wyoming. I stayed home because I was participating in club track and had 2 track meets that week for the Junior Olympics, which I didn't want to miss since they were qualifiers for regionals. My family was gone for a solid 4 days, and during those 4 days, I couldn't help but feel as though I was constantly being watched. During summer, we keep our windows open at night to circulate cold air since our AC unit hasn't been installed. It was late the first night. I was sitting on the couch with our wiener dog, watching Army Wives. The windows and blinds were open. It was complete darkness in the house apart from the TV screen. It was around 11:30 to midnight, when suddenly I saw a bright flash of light reflecting off the walls, coming from outside. I paused the TV, an overwhelming feeling of uneasiness washing over me. I immediately called my boyfriend to tell him what had happened. I then began to hear slight tapping coming from below one of the windows, which was just across from me near our large dining table. I sent my dad a message about what I'd seen, but otherwise sat nearly completely still. Once my boyfriend had convinced me to, I let our other 2 dogs inside the house and bolted to my parents' room. I finally felt comfortable enough to hang up the phone and let my boyfriend sleep. After that night, I was never out and about the house after dark. I would hunker down in my parents' room and turn on a show to fall asleep to. The whole week, things felt off. I would constantly feel the presence of someone else with me, even if I was completely alone. Once my family got back, I felt better, but still uneasy and constantly on edge without even realizing it. On the 4th of July, me, my boyfriend, my dad, and 2 sisters all traveled to the reservation to stay a few days with my dad's family. My father brought a paper bag full of the arrowheads he had found to show his mom, my grandma, who was a professor and anthropologist at the community college on the reservation. She confirmed that they were extremely old. Later that month, my mother, my sisters, grandparents, mom's parents, and I all took a trip to visit my mom's brother, wife, and kids in Tennessee. My father couldn't come due to work. My mother traveled back to Montana after around 4 days because she had to work as well. My father later revealed to me after he picked my sisters and I up from my grandparents when we had returned from our trip, that during those days he was completely alone. Things began to act up again. He began to hear the same voices down near the creek. One night he was in the living room. He could hear people talking by the creek, but wasn't able to make out what they were saying. He grabbed one of his old rifles and a Pendleton blanket and went to check it out. He even took one of our dogs down there. As the 2 ventured down the hill, the voices surrounded them. He said that Marvin, the dog, acted as though he could hear it too, but they never did find anyone. The next night, it was the same scenario, except he could hear distinct whispering coming from just outside the house, near our camper, which is about 100 yards away from the house. Again, he gets up to look, and no one, yet he can sometimes hear the whispering around him. The next day, he decides to leave a tobacco offering and pray to the sun. He began doing traditional ceremonies and leaving offerings, hoping the spirits would leave us alone. He smudged our house as well, and after that, he felt peaceful in the house. He assumed that whatever spirits had been messing with us were now out of the house, but most likely still on the property. It was probably that same night after we had gotten back, maybe the night after that, I had awoken in the late hours of the night. I don't know exactly when, but it was pitch dark in my room, except for a small light illuminating from near my desk. I have a pretty small room, and my desk is on the opposite wall from my bed. Above my desk, I have track medals and ribbons hanging up. I glanced over and watched this small red light move up and then in front of my medals. I knew I wasn't imagining it because I could distinctly see the shadows of my medals hitting the wall. I turned and looked at my ceiling, trying to ignore the light. That's when I noticed what appeared to be a shadow on my ceiling. It looked like someone was standing next to my bed, but with a bright light behind them at their feet. You know the way a person's shadow would be cast across a room if there was a light behind them? It was like that. I felt uneasy but not scared, and fell back asleep. After that, for around a week, I had some very odd experiences. I remember waking up early one morning. The sun hadn't fully risen, and it was in the blue stage of the morning where it's light enough to see. I opened my blinds and looked out my window. It was a peaceful morning. From where my window is, I can see part of the reservoir, which is below our house. There are also large cliffs above the small reservoir, but during the time of year which this story takes place, the reservoir is pretty low, creating banks on all sides of the small body of water. Anyway, I was looking out my window when I noticed a strange-looking rabbit standing near a patch of sagebrush about 30 feet from my window. It moved strangely, almost like it was a doll or stuffed toy. It reminded me of how you would imagine yourself running in a dream, slow and weird movements, almost like it was running in slow motion or in water. But the strangest thing about this rabbit was that it didn't appear to have a head at all. It was only visible to me for maybe 3 seconds before it disappeared behind a large pile of sage. That was when I noticed the second figure. At first, it looked like a white light moving back and forth along the bank of the reservoir. However, as the sun rose, it looked more like a person wearing all white. At certain points, I could see what looked like its legs moving as it walked along the shoreline of the water, but then its legs would disappear, and it would look to be just a torso. It would also disappear behind a hill, then reappear along the bank. It repeated this for maybe a minute or two. All I could do was watch uncomfortably, until finally it moved behind the hill and never came back. Personally, I believe that there is a particular shapeshifter being that resides in central Montana. Or at least, there's multiple. My boyfriend has seen this creature around 2 to 3 times while driving back to his house from mine. And if this post wasn't already so long, I would share those encounters too. Anyway, my only advice is to be aware that things such as that do exist, and to always trust your gut when it comes to it. I can only hope that this thing doesn't follow me anywhere else. My shirt, from Please Stay. All this happened when I was 9, and my friends were 11 and 8. For some background, I am from a small town in South Mississippi. My friends and I did rodeo, and that's where the story begins. We were at the arena practicing, and after rodeo practice, it was about 10 o'clock at night. While growing up, I had experienced many paranormal things, which my friends had always made fun of me for. My friend, who I will call M, dared all of us to go through a hole in a chain-link fence that led to the woods, which we had spotted earlier that night. I, being the level-headed one of the group, told them it was a bad idea. But of course, no one listened. I was the only one with the phone at the time, so we used my phone light and walked about 500 yards away from the arena. We came to the small hole in the chain-link fence. As we approached the fence, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A cabin or cabin lights were on in the woods. In the light of the cabin, I saw a silhouette of a tall man who looked to have been wearing some sort of animal mask. When I pointed this out to my friends, they laughed it off as they slipped through the hole. We started walking towards the lights when I heard a twig snap. I looked to my right, but nothing was there, and I looked back at the cabin, and the silhouette was gone. My friends asked, "Where did the silhouette go?" I turned around to speak, but no words came out of my mouth. My friends' faces went white as I turned around. As I aimed my phone light halfway up an old white oak tree, I saw something that would forever be burned into my mind. There was this horrible 8 to 10 feet tall thing that had a deer skull for a head, a pure black body with long black claws. But instead of deer antlers, it had these corkscrew-shaped horns like a goat. Its eyes were black pits with an inky substance leaking out of them. The thing wrapped one of its arms around the tree before reaching a claw towards me. I screamed, and my friends took off running. I tripped, but soon got up and regained my strength to run. As the chain link fence was coming into view, I heard the sound of fabric tearing and a pull on my shirt. I didn't stop or turn around. I just kept running. As I jumped through the hole, I heard something hit the chain link fence before screaming. I kept running until we made it back to the arena. I ran into the restrooms and looked in the mirror. My shirt had 3 perfect claw marks in it. After that, our friendship fell apart, and I haven't talked to them in many years. I don't know if what I encountered was a Wendigo or goat man, but whatever it was, I knew it wanted to hurt us. Ever since, I've always had nightmares about that thing. That night, I slept in my parents' room. Since then, I've done many drawings of it, but nothing can ever compare to the real thing. I still live in that town, but I'm never out of the house after dark, and I'm never taking another dare from my friends. It found me. From Cameron Wright. This happened a few years ago in the small town of Rocky Mount, North Carolina. I lived on a farm where from each house on the land, you could see the field as far as the eye can see. One night I will never forget. I was 12 at the time, and though I did believe in the paranormal, I'd never experienced anything like what I did that night. It was clear, stars shining beautifully in the sky. We were having a party at my granny's house, and for reference, my house and my granny's are on the same land. Anyway, they had all been drinking, and my dad asked me to walk down to the shed at our house and grab 2 of the jars of wine he had in there. So I did, walking down the dark gravel road, but suddenly everything went quiet. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Now it's normally quiet on the farm as it is, but this was something else entirely. I looked around and immediately saw something in the field. It was this tall, lengthy black figure standing in the open field. We had just finished cutting the wheat, so you could see out there fairly easily. I noticed it had glowing white eyes staring right into my soul. I dashed for my house, since it was closer to me than my granny's, hearing footsteps, and then something climbing over the chain link fence. Once I made it to my house, I ran in and locked the door behind me, hoping this was a dream, praying that what I had just seen was just my mind playing tricks on me. I looked, and I still didn't see it. My 4-wheeler was right next to the shed, so I eventually went, got the jars, and got on the 4-wheeler and took off to my granny's. We moved shortly after the incident, and I thought I was never going to see it again. Until one night at our new house in Tennessee, me and my cousins, we'll call them A, H, and M, were all playing and hanging out in the backyard. Where we were has a huge backyard with woods. Then just behind the woods, there are train tracks. So we're hanging out, laughing, and playing until H says, "I'm gonna go get some ice cream. Anyone else want to come?" They all got excited and went in, but I stayed out because I wasn't very hungry at the time. After they all went inside, I got a familiar feeling, just like I had that night 2 years before. I instantly started looking around when I saw it again, the same figure standing in the trees. It found me, I thought, wondering how in the world it found where I am. I ran inside and my mom asked, "Everything all right?" I knew no one would believe me, so I just said, yeah, everything's fine," kicking myself for not saying something. But now, after that experience, when I go to sleep, I sometimes still get that feeling of dread and uneasiness that I had felt that night at the shed. The first time, from Red Scarecrow 99. I've been lucky enough to have witnessed a great many things in the woods, lakes, and mountains of the Poconos. I've spent my entire life here, and the fairer weather usually has me itching to go fishing with my stepdaughter or taking my dog on a hike. I'll even put the kayak on the lake for some sketchy bass fishing before a thunderstorm. Many people are trying to get 5 more minutes in bed. I'm trying to get 1 more cast in. That being said, it wasn't like that when I was a kid. Hunting wasn't a pastime in my family. I grew up with a little money, so hunting was a way to fill the freezer, even if you did have to freeze and be bored doing it. My father, whom I'm sure many of you had heard about in previous stories, and I had just parked his beat-up S10 at our friend's house in Gouldsboro. I was around 12 at the time, and this was my first year carrying a rifle. I was excited, but not enough to prevent me from sleeping at 4 a.m. on the ride there, so my exact location was unclear. Our buddy had just moved there, and his trailer was situated on the edge of a private forest his landlord gave us all permission to hunt on. They, the adults, were psyched. I just wanted to read my Harry Potter book. We walked for what felt like forever. I'm not sure how long it was, but I was in a hurry to sit down, eat Pop-Tarts, and read. So my father placed me in a section of open pine forest. It was heavily wooded, but had ample clearings for taking good shots. My dad was the kind of guy who, when he put you somewhere to stand, you better stay there. It was barely dawn when he disappeared into the fog that had begun to roll in. I decided to make the best of it. I cleared brush away to be as quiet as possible while sitting and got breakfast ready. I was enjoying the fine cuisine of powdered hot chocolate and strawberry Pop-Tarts. I had just finished a chapter in my book when I finished breakfast. The fog was thick now, and a light breeze had picked up. I only remember this because of the following events. I was reading the second book, The Chamber of Secrets. It felt like I was there for days under that tree, and I decided to hunt by sound, which is code for closing my eyes and napping in case my dad caught me. That's when everything really started. It started off soft, leaves being kicked up, or at least the sound of it. My eyes flew open, and adrenaline hit me. I was 12, and the image of Bambi's dad flooded my mind. I was pumped. Branches and twigs began to snap in the distance, but it was so foggy, I couldn't see past 40 yards. The noises died down ahead of me and out of sight. I cussed under my breath. The breeze must have carried my scent because the sounds were going around me. I quietly stood up and got my rifle ready in my hands. I knew it was close, and it had to come into view sooner or later. My dad would crap his pants if I got the biggest buck of the year. But the woods were quiet. No birds, no wind, no nothing now. I would later learn in life that this is not a good thing. I was elated because I could hear better than I could see, and this gave me an advantage. Or so I thought. The steps were moving in a wide arc around me now. I guessed that Bambi's dad smelled my Pop-Tarts and was trying to find them. The noises of movement, brush moving, and twigs snapping ended in front of me where they began. I was impatiently waiting for my first trophy buck when I saw the outline of a man walking through the fog. I thought my dad had come to get me and just couldn't see me through the fog and got turned around. I was happy and mad at the same time as I began packing up when I lost sight of him. He reappeared moments later, peering out from behind a tree. He reached up to steady himself on an overhead branch as he looked at me before my senses caught up to me. Why wasn't he wearing orange? Where was his rifle? Why was he so dark? Panic set in. I loved to read, and I loved the 000 section at the library. Stories of monsters began to flood my mind. As hysteria set in, I let out a blood-curdling scream as a hand came down on my shoulder. It was my father, who now looked as surprised as me. I quickly told him about the man in the fog and how he watched me and kept walking around me. If F around and find out was a person, that is my dad. At the prospect of some man watching me in the woods, he went right to the tree where I had last seen him. He had his 30-06 trained at the tree. He quickly disappeared behind the giant pine before reappearing. "Nobody here!" he yelled as the blood ran cold in my veins. The branch the man had grabbed above him as he peered out at me was 12 feet off the ground. I told this to my dad, pleaded with him to leave. We did, but only because of the weather. He tried to convince me I'd saw a black bear walking on 2 legs, but my time at the library told me what I had seen. That was the first time I ever encountered what everybody calls Bigfoot. The Thing Behind the Tree, from Gary123. For some context, I am a 28-year-old man, and my dog is 1. She's small and doesn't bark very often, and is usually on the quieter side. The area this story happened in is a remote place in Scotland, with a few surrounding towns, but mainly countryside. So now that I've given context, here's what happened. Where I live, there are many forest trails, the type with a car park and many cyclists. Some have fewer visitors, some have more, it really depends. Now, this trail I took had parking spots for maybe 2 or 3 cars, but I was the only one there. I remember when I pulled up to this place, I had a feeling of dread in my stomach, almost as if something was telling me to go back home. I thought it was weird, but I thought it was because it was 7 p.m. and dark in the Scottish winter. Now, when I say it was dark, I don't mean pitch black. I mean mostly dark, but with a bit of light. So there was no need for a flashlight. Anyway, I got myself and my dog out of the vehicle and went on to the trail. The first 5 minutes of the walk went fine, but after that, my dog started whining as if asking to go back. I ignored her request because she had not done her business yet. As we kept going along, the whines turned into growls as she looked into the shaded and dark forest. I saw her eyes gaze at a particular spot, and as I followed her eyes to where she was looking, I saw it. This thing had the stature of a human, but looked like a wolf. It had pure blood-red eyes, which were easy to see in the darkness. I think I saw claws on it, but I'm not sure. But it was just those eyes peering into my soul. I reacted quickly, picking up my dog while running the 5-minute walk in about 2 minutes. This creature did not follow, nor did it even have a reaction to me or my dog. I don't know what that thing was, but it seemed like it didn't want to cause harm. Wolves aren't seen around here, especially ones with red eyes standing upright. It's been 3 days, and I still struggle to sleep. But safe to say, I will be taking my dog to the park from now on. The Short Hairy Thing, from Stingray 253. The sun beat down on the parched earth, baking the red dirt until it cracked and crumbled beneath my father's boots. He was deep in the heart of the Australian wilderness, the air thick with the scent of eucalyptus and the distant calls of unseen birds. His eyes, squinting against the glare, scanned the dense scrub, searching for the telltale signs of a wild pig. He had been tracking one for days, a particularly large boar that had been terrorizing local farmers. He had been hunting for years, honing his skills in the unforgiving terrain. But this pig was different. It was cunning, elusive, and seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of its surroundings. My father, a man of quiet determination, refused to be outwitted. He followed the pig's trail, his senses sharpened by the thrill of the hunt. The pig's tracks led him to a hidden clearing, a patch of lush green in the otherwise dry landscape. There, in the dappled shade of a giant gum tree, the boar lay, its massive tusks gleaming in the sunlight. My father, with adrenaline coursing through his veins, carefully positioned himself for the shot. He raised his rifle, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the clearing, shattering the stillness. The pig, startled, bolted, its massive body a blur of brown fur as it disappeared into the dense undergrowth. My father, his heart pounding in his chest, gave chase, his boots crunching on the dry leaves. He chased the pig for what seemed like hours, the sun sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the scrub. The pig, however, was relentless, its speed and agility defying his every attempt to close the distance. Finally, as darkness began to fall, he lost sight of the boar. Exhausted and frustrated, he turned back, the taste of defeat bitter on his tongue. Back at his cabin, my father reviewed the footage he had captured on his hunting camera. He had been hoping to get a clear shot of the pig, but the camera had caught something else, something that chilled him to the bone. As he rewound the tape, he saw the pig, its brown fur a dark silhouette against the fading light. But then, just as the pig disappeared into the undergrowth, something else appeared in the frame. It was small, no bigger than a dog, but covered in thick, black fur. It moved with an unnatural speed, a blur of movement that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It crossed the clearing in a flash, disappearing into the shadows before my father could even register what he had seen. He replayed the footage over and over, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had witnessed. It was too fast, too agile, too unlike anything he had ever seen before. It was as if something from another world had crossed into his own. The memory of that encounter haunted him for years. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. He would wake up in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, convinced he could hear something moving in the darkness. He never spoke of what he had seen, not to his friends, not to his family. He knew that they would think he was crazy, that he had let his imagination run wild. But he knew what he had seen, and the knowledge of it filled him with a primal fear that he could never quite shake. The Australian wilderness, once a place of peace and solitude, had become a place of shadows and whispers, a place where the line between reality and nightmare blurred. And my father, forever changed by his encounter with the unknown, lived with the unsettling truth that he was not alone in the vast and unforgiving landscape. It was hunting us. From Commander Shark. In 2020, I was on vacation in New York State, in Eternal Flame Park. I was with my parents and my cousin, and we were road tripping to see pretty waterfalls. We got to one extremely pretty waterfall at sundown, the Eternal Flame Waterfall, which has a methane deposit behind it, which causes an ever-burning flame. We took some photos and admired the view, and started to make our way back down the hour-long hike to the cars. Around 10 minutes in, it got dark. Like, really dark. It was hard to see. Soon an overwhelming stench of rot and death engulfed us. I assumed it was a dead animal and ignored it, but the smell only got worse. Shortly after, we heard footsteps slowly approaching us. By now, we were scared, and I picked up a big stick, thinking I would fight whatever it was off. That's when my grandma's voice called out to me from the woods. "Hey, come here. I hurt my ankle." I froze, horrified. My mom scrambled to check Life 360, which proved my grandma was back in New York City, 200 miles away. That's when I think my cousin realized what it was, because I saw a look of recognition and pure and utter horror sweep across her face. A set of glowing yellow eyes appeared at the tree line, still calling for help, but now in a deep, evil, raspy voice. "Help me! I'm hurt!" I picked up a large rock and threw it, which caused it to shriek this scream like that of a coyote mixed with the velociraptors from Jurassic Park. My rock came flying back out at immense force, slamming into my stomach, causing me to throw up. We started to run and made it back to the car, with this thing all the while chasing us. From what I know now, these things can run fast, so I bet it was playing with us, creating fear and panic before attacking. We managed to reach the car and jump in, where I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out the back window as we sped off. I didn't get a good look at it, but what I managed to see was as horrible as you could imagine. A white, pale face, large bloody broken antlers, yellow dead eyes, sharp teeth. Its gaze pierced my soul as the car sped off. Now, looking back, I believe it to be a Wendigo. In any case, I still have a small scar where the rock hit me, to forever remind me that there are things out there stronger, more dangerous, more brutal, than I never hope to see again. Nightmare Woods, from Autumn Hope Art. My sister and I are 10 months apart in age. She's older and we were never close. I just moved back into town, and she happens to live within 20 minutes. We're in our late 20s, and this is the first time we've ever been friends and have gotten quite close. We talk a lot about growing up, family issues, etc. The topic came up about the neighborhood we grew up in, and playing with neighborhood kids in the surrounding woods. It's here that I'll note our neighborhood was on a street that was literally paved over the Trail of Tears. We dug up pottery, arrowheads, all kinds of things in the creeks and woods. I mentioned that I had this recurring dream about a demon with red eyes that would chase us through those creeks and would dismember the kids like a dog with a chew toy until the creeks were solid red. I had that dream for 12 years until I moved away for college several states away and have never had it again. My sister was shocked and told me her version of the same dream with the same demon. Hers was in the woods, not in the creek, and it would stalk us from the trees. But she described the same demon. This all happened 15 years ago now, and this is the first time we've ever spoken about it. She told me she was so afraid of the woods at night, and that was the reason she never snuck out with me as teenagers. I never believed in ghosts as a kid, but in my early adult years, I've seen so much I can't explain. Thinking about this dream still makes my blood run cold. Creepy golf course, from Anonymous. I'm writing this as a 26-year-old during the beautiful summer daytime. Sometimes, like we all do, I can't fathom how quickly time passes, and nostalgia floods my mind. It's mostly all good thoughts, luckily for me. However, one memory still stays with me in particular. It was during the summer of 2003, so I was 12, and my best friend at the time, let's call her Natalie, was having a birthday party at her house. Her house was pretty big, and was located on a rather large golf course that went across to a highway, and on one side of it was met with woods. As kids do, we got bored after hanging out, talking, and playing music inside, and we decided to play something similar to the Blair Witch Project, basically walking around the woods, trying to scare ourselves. We consisted of about 7 kids in total. It wasn't a huge group, but big enough that if someone were to try to creep one of us out, it would be harder to discern who it actually was. Now, this was during the daytime, so the creep factor was lessened. At first, we started out playing some kind of game. I can't remember exactly what it was. Subsequently, the game ended, probably because someone got bored, and we started meandering around the woods. At this point, the sun started to set. We walked, and I had my head down. I'm a fairly cautious person, so I usually look in all directions, as well as my head down to look where I'm going. And as I took another step, I heard one of the kids off to the left start yelling. The kid took off and was bounding for the golf course. In those nanoseconds, I wondered what the hell it was that freaked him out so much. Maybe he was just being a typical 11-year-old, trying to be random just for the fun of it. I looked around me, and at this point, it started to really get dark. Fast, out of nowhere. I couldn't find my other friends. Natalie had been several feet away, but close enough that if she stopped walking ahead, we'd easily meet up. She was gone. Suddenly, I felt one of the creepiest sensations anybody could have. I felt like I was in sudden silence, and that I was being watched. Actually, more like I was being glared at. You know when you're lying in bed, alone, and it's pitch black, and you get that overwhelming feeling that you need to see what's in front of you, but you're afraid to open your eyes and essentially move. It felt like that. I could see around me, but I didn't know where I was in this patch of forest. Now I started to freak out. I'm level-headed and rational, so I was almost getting irritated that I was feeling this way. This wasn't cool or funny anymore. Where was Natalie? I started calling her name as well as some of the other kids. I heard nothing. Okay, this is really getting not good. It's almost like they set this up beforehand, or something. Paranoid I may be, I needed to get out of there. Finally, I trudged my way out, and I saw the familiar green stretch ahead. I was safe again. Everyone was hanging out by this circular impression in the ground, where we took turns running as fast as we could within it. I asked where everybody was, and why they basically abandoned me. I asked if they heard me, and they each shook their heads. No. A few hours later, we were going to go to the movies to see Austin Powers in Goldmember. We were looking forward to it. We were in a pretty good mood, and I remember this like it was yesterday. Now it was totally pitch black out. As we all walked out of the house and into Natalie's mom's car, a few of us girls at the same time saw the same thing. Off in the distance, a figure of an old man holding a lantern was walking towards our direction. We all screamed and ran to the car. I don't remember us mentioning it later on, but I definitely recall us seeing the same thing and screaming. Maybe it was some kind of maintenance guy who worked on the golf course. No idea, to be honest. I do know it was pretty scary, and especially after that weirdness of the woods before. When you're on a golf course, and it's starting to turn into nighttime, it's easy to get a little spooked, naturally. Where we live, there's tons of Native American history and ancient burials. Maybe it could be that. Thanks for stopping by our little campsite here at Outdoor Terrors. To hear your story on the show, send it to us at darkstories.org. For more scary stories from me, catch me on my other podcasts, Unexplained Encounters and Tales from the Break Room, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Or go to eeriecast.com for those and even more terrifying podcasts. Follow me on X or Twitter at Prevails, and if you don't mind, leave a rating for Outdoor Terrors on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Till next time, I'll see you soon when the campfire blazes once again.